Chris Van Vliet sat down this past week with David Benoit. Kind of a big get for him. This was the first time that David has really sat down for a lengthy, very open interview about what happened with his father at the end of his life there, and a bunch of other things as well. I thought that he did an excellent job with this. To give Chris his props, I thought that he handled this perfectly and got a lot more out of David than probably anybody else has. I know he's done some podcast interviews and things of that nature, but this was really very eye-opening in a lot of ways, and a little eye-opening in some kind of disconcerting ways, which I'll get to here in a second. But we got to learn a lot more about him and what he does for a living. For example, I didn't know that David Benoit has been working in the oil fields up in Canada, and apparently doing very well. I guess work in the oil fields there must be very lucrative because he gets paid very well for that line of work. But he says that he would give it all up to become a pro wrestler. He's got his gear already made. You know, he talks about this like it really is his passion in life. He wants to get into the same business that his father was in and that he was a fan of ever since he was a kid. And he's been saying this for a while now. Every time he does some kind of interview, he says he wants to be a wrestler. How many years now have we been hearing this for? And I have not seen or heard about him making any real progress whatsoever towards that goal. I'm not even sure if he's actively training at the moment. Outside of him in the interview here talking about Davey Boy Smith Jr., the Bulldog's son, helping him out a lot and doing some training with him, but I don't know if he's actively training at the moment or going to a school or a camp or anything like that to really hone his craft and become a pro wrestler. He's yet to have a single match. I know he did sign up for one of Lance Storm's classes at his old Storm Wrestling Academy, but he didn't stay very long. And that was probably 6 or 7 years ago now. In fact, if I remember correctly, he joined the class, and you can even see him in some of the old class photos right when they were getting started. And I think he was, I don't want to say instantly, but he didn't stick around very long at all. And I don't know what his mindset was, why that happened, or why he pulled himself out of there, or if something else happened, but that didn't really go anywhere. Clearly, though, he wants to become a wrestler. You can hear it in his voice, you can see it in his face, and just the words and everything he says. But I do wonder how much of that is him wanting to follow in his father's footsteps and do him proud. He idolizes his father. That's very clear listening to him speak. And of course he did. It's his dad. That man that did what he did in 2007 is not the man that he knew. That's not the man that he grew up with. He revered this man, Chris Benoit. He loved him. He claimed during the interview that his father was offered a backstage role as a producer by WWE in 2006. This was during a time where Benoit was away for a few months. He was healing up some injuries. And he said his father turned it down. He wasn't ready to retire yet. He turned it down. He did come back to the ring, I think at No Mercy that year. Then they talked about the tragedy. And this is where I thought Van Vliet did a good job of navigating things. It didn't come off in a tabloid way or, so hey, tell me what happened that day when your father did what he did. It just, they sort of eased into it. And David at one point said, "No, it's fine. I don't mind talking about this. In fact, I've been wanting to get this off my chest for a long time. It feels good to talk about this and kind of get this all out in the open." So maybe for him, it was some kind of therapeutic experience. It didn't feel like he was exploiting the situation or anything like that. Chris, that is. So they get into it. And he said at first he thought it was a joke. He didn't believe it was real. He was up in Edmonton, where he lived and I think still lives. And his mom got a call from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police telling her to fly down to Georgia. Chris's father went down, which would have been David's grandfather. He went down instead. Since David's mom had 2 kids to take care of, she couldn't leave. And so David's grandfather went down instead. That's Michael Benoit. So then his mind shifts to the idea that somebody must have broken into the house and killed them. Because now that he realizes this is real, this is not This is not a prank or something like that. He goes, somebody must have broken in. Must have been some kind of intruder, or maybe a robber or something, and he killed them all. That was his second thought. I can remember exactly where I was. I mean, I'm not the man's son, so I mean that's a whole other situation. But a lot of wrestling fans and people within wrestling who knew Chris and worked with Chris and were friends with Chris and close people even, like a Jericho or a Dean Malenko who knew him going back probably, 15 years, 20 years. Knew where they were when they first heard the news. I knew where I was. I can still remember where I was when I first read the news that Chris Benoit had passed away. I feel like that's something a lot of wrestling fans would remember. Like where they were, or what you were doing when you heard the news. I was getting ready to leave the office. It was almost, it was 5 o'clock or after 5 o'clock. I was getting ready to leave. I did one quick check of some wrestling news websites before the 3-hour Raw show that night. This is back when 3 hours of Raw was a novelty and not a penalty. This was the night that Vince McMahon was going to be eulogized. This was the Vince McMahon funeral, kind of in a morbid, twisted, ironic kind of way, episode of Monday Night Raw. And I see the news on one of these websites. I see the headline that Chris Benoit is dead, and I'm stunned beyond belief. Then I opened the page to read the report, and I saw that not only was Chris Benoit dead, but his whole family was dead. His wife was dead, his 7-year-old son was dead, and my jaw just dropped. And my immediate thought, to hear David talk about how he thought it was an intruder and all that, my immediate thought was carbon monoxide poisoning. They must have been in that house all weekend and nobody could get a hold of them because there was a carbon monoxide leak. Maybe they didn't have an alarm and they all passed away. And that would be awful enough if that happened. But obviously not nearly as awful as what really happened that weekend. So these are the kind of thoughts that were running through his head at the time. And he said, he didn't get to see his dad that much, maybe 4 weeks during the year, 2 weeks around Christmas time. The last time they spoke was on Father's Day, which I think was probably, about a week? Less than a week, I think, before the weekend where the incident happened. They were making plans for the summer, for David to come down to visit in Georgia, and everything sounded fine, and he got to tell his dad he loved him, and there was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing abnormal about the conversation or anything like that. He said after the incident happened, he goes, the news was just nonstop. Said it was either about steroids. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me with this Siri shit again? Really, Siri? Can we not do this again, please? Anyway, he said the news was just nonstop after the incident happened. All people wanted to talk about, all the people on TV, all they wanted to do was talk about steroids and more steroids. He mentioned Nancy Grace, or as I call her, Nancy Disgrace, which is what that woman is. A terrible, vile creature of a human being is Nancy Grace, always will be. He says he couldn't even walk around. He couldn't go anywhere. He couldn't finish school. He was 14 years old or 15 years old. He couldn't finish his finals. He eventually finished high school, but not that year. That's how bad it was. And in reference to all of the conspiracy theories about what might have happened that day, he claims his family had law enforcement investigate Kevin Sullivan after the murders to rule him out as a suspect. I don't think that's how it works. All you law enforcement people listening can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that's quite how it works, where he gets to dictate that or have any control over that. But perhaps in the normal course of their police work, they interviewed Sullivan since he was Nancy's ex-husband. Maybe that would be normal. I don't know. I still shake my head at the people who, all these years later, peddle this conspiracy theory bullshit that Kevin Sullivan was behind it. Kevin Sullivan murdered them all. But it's on the internet, so you're going to have people like that floating around, unfortunately. Floaters, that's what I call them. For a lot of reasons. Floaters is an appropriate word for these people. Planting ideas like that in this kid's head. David's 27 years old now, so he would have been about 14 years old when all this went down. he was an impressionable young man. So I'm sure he heard a lot of wild theories. And he probably clinged to every single one of them because nobody could figure out why or how something like this could happen. I've heard Chris Jericho talk about that before. That's the thing that's most maddening about this. Why? Why? There was no note. There was no sense that something like this was going to happen, and you're left with nothing but lingering questions. Now imagine if you're his kid. 14 years old, you just talked to your father a week ago, you're making plans to come down, Father's Day, I love you, all this stuff, and then boom, this happens. You're going to hear every wild theory under the sun, and yet everything is going to sound plausible to you because you can't come up with a good explanation on your own. So your mind starts to wander. It's awful. It's awful. And the people who peddle that bullshit don't think about things like that. They didn't think about the effect that maybe it would have on his kids. He talked about the movie Crossface. If you remember, there was an announcement made a few years ago. They were going to make a movie about Chris Benoit, his story, and the final days of his life. It was going to be based around the book Ring of Hell that was written by Matt Randazzo. And we have not heard anything about this movie since then. And David said that the project is dead, which is why we haven't heard anything. And he said that he told Chris here in this interview that they needed the permission of the family members in order to do the movie and to move forward with the movie, but the family just refused to give it to them. He said they had seen the script and all this other stuff, but they would not let them make the movie. He said the family hired an attorney to make sure that it got shut down. And he said the family would not be opposed to a documentary about Chris Benoit. And he said, look, I have a lot of home movies at home with my dad that have never been seen before. But Lexi Alexander, who was the person who was tapped to direct the film, said the movie was dead, but that whole story about lawyers and everything is just made up. Said they really just made up some stuff. I never sent anybody a script, but I did have a very nice and very polite conversation, which I still have a copy of, he says, with Nancy's sister, Sandra, who told me of her own plans to bring the story to the screen herself, and I fully encourage that. And so Randazzo had chimed in. He said there were no legal threats. That never happened. He says he left because there were just constant delays over casting and financing and, problems with the script. And Nancy's sister wanted to pursue a movie of her own. And he said that he was never aware of there being any legal threats. So again, that's the story that David tells. I don't know. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle about exactly what got the movie shut down. But that movie is not happening. And I, for one, am happy about that because that movie, it just would have been about what happened in the last weekend of his life and probably reenacting that on screen. And who needs to see that shit? I mean, it was so long ago, but it wasn't, if that makes sense. It's hard to believe that this all happened. It was almost 13 years ago. It feels more recent than that. I don't know that that's something that too many people want to live through again, but at some point, there may well be a story about his life and what happened there at the end, but I can't say that I'm disappointed to hear that this movie is not actually being filmed. So then we got into some of this stuff where it gets into delusions of grandeur. He said that he believes his father will one day be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. I can understand him wanting his father to be in the Hall of Fame, and he mentioned, he goes, if you look at his career, he accomplished so much. He was a great wrestler throughout his life, throughout his career. And he was. Absolutely. And I don't have any problem going back and watching Chris Benoit matches. It does make me think about what happened. It does bring up some awful memories. Some people just can't watch them at all. I'm okay with that if I'm watching an old Nitro or an old WCW pay-per-view or even a WWE pay-per-view. I don't fast forward through the Chris Benoit match. I can watch them and be okay. And I can understand the people who can't and just don't want to go back and watch that stuff. You cannot deny that as a wrestler, he was one of the very best. Nobody is denying that. But this idea that he believes that one day, even if it's years from now, that one day, Chris Benoit will be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, it's just delusional. Plain and simple. Absolutely delusional. It will never, ever happen. Nor should it. People like to say, you can separate the two. You can't separate the two. That's not how this works. You can't separate the two. For the Hall of Fame induction, you can't separate the two. It is impossible. Cannot be done. But he is very enthusiastic about the idea of wrestling under his father's name. We're not just talking about him getting involved in wrestling as, David Benoit, the son of Chris Benoit, which he will never be able to avoid. Clearly, he doesn't want to avoid it, but even if he wanted to, there's no way around it unless he has plastic surgery, like the movie Face Off, and they replace his face with somebody else's. You can't not look at this kid and see his father. It's almost a spitting image. How much he looks like his father. So he will always be looked at a certain way because of that. But he is totally enthusiastic about getting involved in wrestling as basically Chris Benoit Jr. Christopher is his middle name. His full name is David Christopher Benoit, so in his mind, he can do it because I'm just taking my middle name, like legally. He says, I can do it. It's my middle name. He would like to wrestle as Chris Benoit. He's had tights made to mirror the tights that his father used to wear, with the Rabid Wolverine tights with the claw marks on them. He says he's been in touch with Our Lady Peace, who did Benoit's last theme song in WWE, about working on something for him, or possibly even using the same song for himself. Our Lady Peace has previously in interviews said that they would never perform Chris Benoit's theme song ever again due to the nature of how he died. So, now they said perform his song. Maybe they wouldn't have an issue with somebody else using it. I don't know. That seems to fly in the face with where their headspace was at least years ago. Maybe they've had a change of heart. Now, mind you, I'm mentioning all of this stuff. David Benoit has not had an official match yet. We have no idea if he has an aptitude for this, how good or bad he is. We know nothing. There's never been even an exhibition. So this is all very premature, but man, I'm listening to this. The reality is this. He is never going to be treated like everybody else. He will never get a fair shot in wrestling. I'm sorry to say it. It's not going to happen. He looks like his father. He sounds like his father. He even laughs like his father. He wants to use his father's name. He wants to use his father's music. He wants to use his father's tights. If he's serious about this, and he wants more than anything to live his dream and be a pro wrestler, he's going to have to let some of that stuff go. And somehow, and I don't know how, I mean, maybe he wears a mask, I don't know, but somehow find a way to blaze his own path. I mean, it's bad enough if you're the son of Ric Flair. Look what David Flair went through many years ago. Greg Gagne, or even some of the other stories in wrestling where a son tried to follow in his father's footsteps. There are situations, I'm sure. You look at Charlotte as the daughter of Ric Flair. There are exceptions to that, but that can be difficult enough as it is. But I can't think of another situation like this where the father has done what he did and you're trying to actively follow in his footsteps, right down to using his same name. There's never been a situation like this before. He'd have to somehow find a way to blaze his own path. He can still honor his father's memory in his own way. But if the goal is to basically become Chris Benoit, he's not going to find work with any major promotion. I just can't see it. I just don't. These are unrealistic goals that he has. And it sucks because he didn't do anything wrong. He was a victim of circumstance. None of this is his fault. He didn't do anything wrong. He's paying a price for the sins of his father. And maybe those sins were largely contained to one weekend of his life, but they're still his sins, not his son's. So, absolutely, it's a shame. It's not anything that he brought on himself, but this is just a reality that at some point, no matter how hard he may kind of forge ahead, at some point, reality is going to smack him in the face, and he's going to have to figure out, is this what I want to do? And if so, I got to find a different way to do it, because I just don't see where are these opportunities going to come from. Maybe there's some indie promotion who wants to generate buzz, and at some point, if David Benoit begins wrestling, they'll be more than happy to bring him in. You'll always find some indie promotion somewhere willing to do something like that. They don't care, they just want the attention. So they'll bring him in, they'll put Chris Benoit's name on posters and stuff, and they'll probably sell some tickets. But if his goal is to one day get to WWE and be on television and become a big star in the mainstream like that, I just cannot envision a scenario in which that ever happens. It's just very difficult for me to picture how that happens.